All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going all the way to Uttarakhand, specifically Bageshwar. And we're going to be talking about something that I think is going to be really interesting and really important for our UPSC aspirants out there. We're talking about the impacts of soapstone mining. We've got a couple of really great sources for this deep dive. We have a recent article from the Indian Express, and we also have a report from Down to Earth. And both of these sources actually focus on a case in the Uttarakhand High Court about this unregulated mining that's happening.
Yeah, and it's a case I think with pretty big implications. We're talking about environmental law and sustainable development and cultural heritage, even disaster management, really key areas for the UPSC exams.
So to kind of set the scene here, the court case actually got started because of a news article.
Hmm?
It was highlighting some of the dangers that residents in Kandatesal are facing because of all these mines. Over 160 unregulated soapstone mines, just in Bageshwar alone. That's a lot. So I guess to kind of get started here, what exactly is soapstone? Why is it so sought after? What's the big deal?
Okay, so soapstone is a rock. It's a metamorphic rock. It's really soft. And it's made up mostly of talc, which is what gives it that smooth, almost soapy feel. It's pretty incredible how versatile it is. They use it for everything from countertops and building materials, even sculptures, and you even find it in baby powder. Its heat-resistant properties make it really, really valuable across a whole bunch of different industries.
So it's valuable, but the extraction process seems to be causing some problems.
So,
The Down to Earth report actually specifically points to a lack of regulation as one of the core issues here. They even point out that something called semi-mechanized mining isn't really clearly defined by either the state or central government.
yeah, and that ambiguity, it creates a pretty big loophole because without a clear definition, these mining operations can just use heavy machinery without having to go through any environmental impact assessments.
Yeah.
It's basically a free pass to operate without any accountability.
So they're basically bypassing all the safeguards that are supposed to protect the environment. Which brings us to the environmental concerns themselves. The report mentions land subsidence as a major issue. And, I mean, thinking about this, it kind of makes me think back to the Joshimath crisis we saw last year.
Yeah, it's a good comparison and one that I think our UPSC aspirants should definitely wrap their heads around. Joshimath is also in Uttarakhand, and they experienced some really, really severe land subsidence led to cracks in buildings. People had to leave their homes. A big factor in that crisis was just uncontrolled construction and infrastructure projects that really destabilized the Himalayan slopes, which are already kind of fragile.
And it sounds like this soapstone mining in Bageshwar is making those vulnerabilities even worse. The report suggests that all this mining activity, especially on lower slopes, it further destabilizes the land. It increases the risk of subsidence.
Exactly. And you think about areas like Khanda, where a lot of these mines are concentrated. They're sitting on loose, loamy soil. And that soil type, coupled with the vibrations and disruptions from all the mining activity, creates like a perfect storm for subsidence to happen.
And it's not just the area right around the mines that's affected either. The Down to Earth report talks about a wider impact on the soil and the water resources.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And the lack of things like green belts and retaining walls makes the problem even worse. Soapstone mining creates a lot of dust and debris, and without proper controls in place, that stuff just washes into the nearby water sources and pollutes them. And then the loosened soil, it's super susceptible to erosion, especially during monsoon season.
So it's almost like this ripple effect. The damage from these mines is spreading way beyond just where they're located. And the report keeps mentioning the lack of green belts and retaining walls as being a major part of this. Why aren't those things being put in place? Is it just an oversight?
I don't think it's just a simple oversight. I think there are probably a lot of different factors. One possibility is that there's just not enough political will or enforcement of the regulations that already exist. There could also be economic pressures. Maybe there's pressure to keep the soapstone flowing because it is such a valuable commodity. It could be a combination of all these things. A really complicated web of challenges that are really hard to untangle.
So we need to dig a little deeper into those political and economic factors for sure.
Hmm.
But before we do that, maybe we can switch gears a little bit and talk about the cultural impacts of these mines. Because it's not just the environment that's being harmed.
You're absolutely right. And this is another area where UPSC aspirants should be paying attention. Cultural heritage is often very tied to the environment, and damage to one can really have profound impacts on the other.
The Indian Express article specifically mentions damage to traditional Kumani Bakli houses. Can you tell us a little bit about those houses? What makes them so special? And why is their destruction such a concern?
So Kumani Bakli houses are They're these incredible examples of vernacular architecture. They're built using local materials and techniques that have been passed down for generations. And one of the coolest things about them is they're earthquake resistant. They are designed to withstand the seismic activity that's really common in the Himalayan region.
So they're not just beautiful examples of this traditional architecture, they're also incredibly resilient. But the report suggests that the subsidence from all this mining, it's undermining their foundations. It's putting these houses at risk.
Exactly. The stability of those houses, it really depends on the integrity of the land that they're built on. So when the ground beneath them starts shifting and subsiding, it compromises their structural integrity.
Yeah.
And that makes them much more vulnerable to damage and even collapse.
It's almost tragic. These houses were designed to withstand earthquakes, but they're being undermined by human activity. And it's not just the houses. The Indian Express article also mentions this 10th century temple that's now showing signs of damage.
Right. The Kalika Temple in Kanda. It's not only a place of worship, but also a historical landmark. It represents the cultural heritage of that entire region. And the cracks that are starting to show up in the structure, those are a direct result of the subsidence that's being caused by these mines.
And that brings us to, I think, a really crucial point here. This interconnectedness between the environmental damage and the cultural damage. It's not just about separate issues. These things they're intertwined. Damage to the environment often translates into damage to cultural heritage as well.
Absolutely. And this case study, it's a perfect illustration of that. You've got the unregulated mining that's leading to this environmental degradation, and then that degradation is causing this irreparable harm to the cultural fabric of the region. It's a reminder that environmental protection and cultural preservation, they really go hand in hand.
And for UPSC aspirants out there, this case study, I think it underscores this really key concept of sustainable development.
Yeah.
Finding ways to progress economically without jeopardizing the environment or eroding that cultural heritage.
Yeah.
And this case really clearly shows what can happen when that balance is disrupted.
Exactly. Sustainable development requires careful planning and responsible governance, and a real commitment to preserving that delicate balance between human needs and environmental protection. And this case study offers some really valuable insights into how challenging that is.
Okay, so we've talked about the lack of regulation and the environmental damage and the cultural impact, but what about the economic side of things? Soapstone mining, it brings some economic benefits to the region, right? Can we completely disregard those?
That's a really important question, and one that I think comes up a lot in these conversations about sustainable development. We can't just ignore the economic benefits of these industries. They provide jobs, they generate revenue, they contribute to the local economy. But it's crucial to make sure that those benefits aren't achieved at the cost of long-term environmental and cultural damage.
So it's about finding that balance. Maximizing the economic benefit while minimizing the negative impacts.
Exactly. Making sure that the benefits from the mining are distributed equitably, that the local communities have a voice in what's going on, and that those environmental and cultural safeguards are actually enforced.
But how do we ensure that happens in practice? It's easy to talk about striking a balance, but, the reality on the ground is often quite different.
Yeah. It's not an easy task. It requires kind of a multi-pronged approach. First, we need clear regulations that are actually enforceable, regulations that govern mining activities. And those regulations, they should mandate these comprehensive environmental impact assessments and require companies to take steps to mitigate the environmental damage.
So basically closing those loopholes that allow for this unchecked exploitation. What else?
We need strong community engagement. Local communities, they're the ones who are most affected by these activities. So their voices need to be heard. They should be involved in the decision-making process, and their concerns should be addressed.
That makes sense. Giving local communities a seat at the table. That can help make sure that their interests are being protected. Anything else?
Finally, we need to promote alternative livelihoods. When a region is over-reliant on one single industry, like soapstone mining, it makes them vulnerable to economic shocks and environmental degradation. So encouraging things like diversification and the development of other economic activities can help reduce that dependency and promote a more sustainable development path.
So basically creating a more resilient and sustainable economic ecosystem. That's a valuable insight, especially for our UPSC aspirants who might be tasked with coming up with policies to address these kinds of challenges.
For sure, this case study, it's a real-world example of just how complicated it is to balance economic development with environmental and cultural preservation. It highlights the need for this holistic approach that takes into account just how interconnected these issues are.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. We've uncovered some pretty complex layers to this issue, And it's clear that there are no easy solutions.
Yeah, these are tough challenges. They require careful consideration and collaboration and a commitment to that long-term sustainability.
But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to that question about the economic benefits of this soapstone mining. The report focuses a lot on the negative impacts, but who's actually benefiting the most from this industry?
Yeah, that's a crucial question, and it's one that I think often gets overlooked. While mining can generate revenue and create jobs, those benefits are not always distributed equally. In a lot of cases, the profits from mining, they mostly benefit large corporations and investors, while the local communities, they end up bearing the brunt of the environmental and social costs.
So it's almost like this situation where the profits are flowing out of the region, while the environmental and cultural costs, they're being shouldered by the local communities. That raises some serious questions about equity and sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. It really highlights the need for more transparency and accountability in the mining industry. We need mechanisms in place to make sure that the benefits from mining are shared more fairly and that the local communities have a real say in how these resources are managed.
This has been an incredibly informative deep dive. We've really explored a lot here. The legal side, the environmental side, the cultural impact, the economic dimensions, and it's clear that this unregulated soapstone mining in the Bageshwar, it's a complicated issue with some pretty far-reaching consequences. And for our UPSC aspirants out there, this case study, I mean, it's a goldmine of insights. It touches on so many key themes that are relevant to the exams.
It really does. It demonstrates just how interconnected everything is: environmental protection, cultural preservation, sustainable development, the equitable distribution of resources. It's like a real world example of the kinds of complexities that policymakers have to face and how important it is to find these holistic
Sure.
solutions.
Okay, so let's try to distill some of the key takeaways for our listeners,
Mm.
especially for those who are, you know, getting ready for those UPSC exams. What are the most important things to remember from this case study?
Okay, so first and foremost, I think this case really highlights just how critical it is to have clear regulations and to actually enforce them. That ambiguity in the definitions, like what we saw with the semi-mechanized mining, that creates loopholes. And those loopholes allow these unsustainable practices to just keep going.
Right. Closing those loopholes it's essential. What else? What else stands out?
The second thing I would say is just remember how interconnected the environmental and cultural damage is. This case is a perfect example of how damage to the environment can lead to the loss of cultural heritage. So it's important to remember, don't look at these things in isolation. They're all part of this larger system.
And then finally, this case, it really underscores just how badly we need a more balanced approach to development, one that's actually equitable. We can't just keep prioritizing economic growth, at the expense of the environment and the well-being of these local communities. Sustainable development means finding ways to balance all these competing interests.
Yeah.
I think that's a crucial point, especially for our aspiring policymakers. Economic development is important, but not at any cost.
Okay. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, something to kind of chew on. If soapstone is such a valuable resource, I mean, they use it for everything, from buildings to baby powder. How can we make sure that extracting it doesn't come at the cost of people's safety and their livelihoods and their cultural heritage?
Huh.
That's a challenge that demands some really innovative solutions and a real commitment to those sustainable practices.
It definitely does. That's a question that should be, front and center in any conversation about resource extraction and development. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and informative. Don't forget to subscribe and like our podcast for more deep dives on all sorts of important and fascinating topics. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking those critical questions.